We are joined today by Tina Ngata, who is calling from Aotearoa, but I'll leave it up for Tina to introduce herself.
Oh, kia ora, Nick. Tēnā koutou. Yep, my name is Tina Ngata. I am a Ngāti Porou wāhine from the East Cape of Te Ika Maui in Te Whananui-a-Kio. I'm one of the many Moana nations of the Pacific.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. And we're not talking necessarily about Aotearoa today, or we're talking actually about Kanaky, or a place also known as New Caledonia. Some of our podcast listeners might not be familiar with this, especially with the genocide going on in Gaza, but nonetheless, it's very pertinent to indigenous decolonial movements, and especially in this particular moment. So maybe you can give us just kind of a brief synopsis of what is going on right now in Kanaky.
Sure, Nick. So, conflict has broken out again in Kanaky. It's been an ongoing kind of a rights crisis there for decades. And in fact, obviously, as a nation undergoing colonialism, that always results in a crisis. So the crisis arguably has been ongoing since French tried to annex it, or did actually illegally annex it in the 1800s. And so, for a long time, the French government have oppressed the Kanak people there. And there have been multiple uprisings and political movements. And so they have been on a process of granting independence back to Kanak people in New Caledonia for some time, but they've also been undermining that process for quite some time. They've been scheduled to achieve independence in Kanaky, but there have been multiple things happening. So, for instance, the importing of French citizens, the incentivizing of French citizens in order to, decrease the relative population of Indigenous peoples there. And then also increased militarization and similar to all colonial experiences, policies and legislation that amount to oppression of the people. So after a long time and a lot of patience and many peaceful protests over the recent months, the Kanak people have moved into civil unrest. And this was warned to the French government that if they weren't listening to them, if they weren't taking action and listening to their many peaceful movements, that it would result in civil unrest. And those warnings have been ignored by the French government. So there's been more French military imported in. Militarization has hyped up. There have been a number killed. The majority killed have been Kanak youth, and it's largely been an uprising of youth who have just said enough is enough. And I think really the breaking point for that was that, there's an agreement that the Kanak peoples and the French government were working on to achieve independence, and that, as I said, was getting undermined. And then President Macron just made the very audacious statement last year that the French government were essentially going to ditch that agreement, throw it out, and draft a new process. And they've made it quite clear through declarations of military and economic strategies that, in fact, they don't and never really had any intention to leave. And so it's just really an enough is enough moment. It's the very human nature response to reach for justice. That's what we're seeing happening in the uprisings. It's a reach for justice. And it's being responded to by even more militarism. Added to that, you have the issue of local French militia, settler militia. So the government has incentivized quite far right nationalist people to move there, ex-military, ex-police, and they have access to, warfare level arms. And so they have also been shooting at using flamethrowers. We're seeing them using flamethrowers on the streets against these youth. there've been extrajudicial detention happening at the hands of the police as well. And more recently, there's footage that's come to light of them restraining and then kicking Kanaky in the head until they're unconscious. And over 470 Kanaky youth, which have been displaced, taken to other islands into detention centres pending investigation, and some have been moved to France pending investigation. So a lot of human concerns over the human rights abuses that we're seeing coming out. And a lot of this is also, the voice is being constrained. We know that, of course, civil reporting, or the reporting on the ground from the people, is one of the most important ways that we've found out about what's happening on the ground in Gaza. We saw that being really important in Mauna Kea and in Standing Rock as well. And so the French government have banned TikTok. And we see these kinds of things happening where they intend to carry out state violence. So we're increasingly concerned about the deteriorating situation there.
Yeah, thanks for that kind of brief overview of what's the current situation. I think what's fascinating about this, the situation between Kanaky and the French government, is that this is just a classic case of colonialism, even by a definition of UN standards. Like there's the saltwater thesis, right? So France is being still a colonial power in the sense that it's an overseas power directly interfering with the affairs of this government, or of this this territory, this indigenous territory, while also participating in a very violent, what it sounds like, a very violent settler colonial project, as it did in a place like Algeria. So this isn't something that is a deviation from the norm. And I think also what Gaza tells us in this moment, and what Palestine tells us in this moment, is that settler colonialism and the violence and the barbarity of colonialism is not a 19th century phenomenon. It's not a 21st or 20th century phenomenon. It's a 21st century phenomenon, and it's very much a modern sort of everyday reality that we're seeing. And it's what you're saying is also kind of parallel to the way that Palestinians have also struggled, and many of our people have also struggled. Like in the Great March of Return, it was a non-violent movement, right? So all of the pundits, all the pro-genocide commentators who are deploring the Palestinian resistance and their internationally recognized right to self-defense, and saying that they, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? And it's like, well, Israeli snipers assassinated thousands of them, and now we're seeing that happen over and over. And we can see this in this particular moment with Kanaky people who are rightfully using all means at their disposal. And in this sense, it was legal means, trying to get a referendum vote, and we can see that the same tactics are employed in this instance. It sounds like it's the illegal enfranchisement of French settlers to essentially outnumber the indigenous vote for independence. And I was wondering, in this particular region, I was wondering if you could give us just a sort of a history of French colonialism in this area, just because I don't think a lot of people really realize that France still has colonies, and like that this is this is still an issue for a vast majority of not just people in the world, but an issue for people living in the Pacific, the indigenous people.
Sure. So yeah, France has a number of different, I think 13 colonies still. And the vast majority of those, if not all of those, are listed with the United Nations and scheduled for decolonization. And in fact, a number of people that have been imported into France have also been imported from other French colonies as a part of a penal exchange. So they have, well, not an exchange because they've just been exported there and actually been incentivized to stay there as well. So James Cook, who led, the British colonization across much of what we call Te Moananui-a-Kiwa, which is what the rest of the world refers to as the Pacific region. But Te Moananui-a-Kiwa is has a number of French colonies. So you have obviously Tahiti and French Polynesia, Wallis Futuna, as well, and New Caledonia, so-called New Caledonia. Kanaky is one of those places. So 1853, under the Napoleon Empire, they annexed Kanaky, and even the name Kanaky came out of the French word. The French would call the indigenous people Kanak as an insult, and they referred to them like as slaves as well. And in fact, the history of slavery is also very present there. So our term for slavery in Te Moananui-a-Kiwa is blackbirding. It was a whole economy of taking people from their islands, putting them on boats, putting them on ships, shipping them across to Central and South America to be sold in slave auctions, but also sending them to be slaves on sugar plantations in Australia and in Hawaii as well. So Kanaky was subjected to blackbirding. They also had, as I said before, numerous people imported there. So it was a penal colony. So the French government would import prisoners there from its other colonies and then tell them to stay there, as a direct and intentional means of populating the island with non-Indigenous people. And then, of course, the Declaration for the Granting of Independence to Colonized Lands and Peoples came out of the UN as early as 1960, and they were scheduled back then also. And then there have been multiple uprisings between the 60s, 70s. You had the civil rights movement. Globally, you had these reaches for justice throughout the 60s and 70s, and that was also happening in Kanaky. And just as you mentioned before about the assassination of rights leaders in Palestine, Kanaky rights leaders have also been assassinated by the French. They've been sniped on the streets by French government, and killed throughout this process as well. And so there were uprisings in the 80s as well, another reach for justice. And then in the 80s, they were scheduled again with the United Nations to be decolonized. And so I think, France, like Israel, are aware of the social capital of the process of decolonization and the language around decolonization. So they've said the things that make it sound like they're doing the right thing. But I think, when we look at situations like Palestine and like Kanaky, you can see the futility of systems like the United Nations. Very good intentions there, and great people trying to do good things, but unable to stop a genocide in Palestine, unable to decolonize Kanaky. And so, in spite of that declaration and scheduling, there has been an agreement, the Nouméa Accord, and that happened off the back of, again, state violence. People had been murdered by the French state. People were being oppressed, heavily oppressed, brutally, violently oppressed by the French state in the lead up to those accords. And so Kanak leaders, really had to consider, they were really trying to get their people into a space of safety. And so the Nouméa Accord was the agreement with the French government around a pathway to independence for the people. But even within that, there are, things that we need to look carefully at. So there's the 3 referendums that were agreed to. Now, even within the United Nations and within that declaration and within UN discourse on human rights, and of course within the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we acknowledge that the right to self-determination is inalienable. It's an inalienable right. That's one to get your tongue around. It's an inalienable right because, you can't, when we say that, we mean it can't be taken away even by referendum. So incredibly generous of the leaders, but also, being aware of the coercion of the time. but very generous of them to agree to 20 years, considering the declaration says nothing should impede the process of independence. Very generous of them to include settlers in those referendums, the ones that were present there in 1998, considering you should never vote alongside settlers for your liberation as an Indigenous peoples. Very generous of them to agree to referendums at all, considering the right is inalienable. And even in spite of that, since 1998, when the accord was finally signed, the French government, have continued to undermine it. So, even as recently as 2021, where they're supposed to be, moving towards the end of this agreement, France releases the Indo-Pacific strategy. And their Indo-Pacific strategy outlines, clear intentions to maintain their economic stranglehold on New Caledonia. They often talk about how, we need to delay this process because New Caledonia is dependent upon the French government to the tune of $1.2 billion a year. But what they don't say is that they extract over $2 billion a year from their economy in nickel alone, because New Caledonia is one of the world's largest nickel producers, of course, and nickel is a core component for e-batteries, right? So they extract far more than what they give. And we know that. And we also know that any wealth that goes into that nation or is retained or generated by that nation of Kanaky does not go to Kanaky people. It goes to, French settlers and the upper echelons, socioeconomic echelons, where Kanaky people have been denied access to. And so, it's been, there's this consistent undermining in the messaging that they say on this side, which is conflicting with the messaging on the other side. They've expressed clear and military intentions for the area. And so the French military presence in Te Moananui-a-Kiwa is also long-standing. And in the 1980s, we had the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific movement, where we united across our Pacific region, Te Moananui-a-Kiwa, to oppose weapons testing. So, France has used us as a penal colony, our region as a penal colony. They've used us as a weapons testing zone. Of course, so-called United States does that as well in Hawaii. And they have tested nuclear weapons, which is still resulting in radiation poisoning today for islands in the Pacific. Babies born without skull caps, women who can't, give birth, and, high rates of cancer, ruined food systems. And so these things have happened at the hands of largely the United States government and the French government in our region. So the militarization obviously becomes a significant issue in light of so-called US and China rivalry. The geopolitics of our region are quite intense at the moment. We're sitting between two major world superpowers who are at odds with each other. China is one of the largest purchasers of that nickel. And at the same time, they also have economic investment around the region. And of course, you have US with its own colonies as well in Hawaii, Guam, American Samoa, and their own military outposts there. And you have military agreements such as AUKUS, Australia, UK, USA military agreement. So these tensions are rising, and as those tensions rise, the strategic geopolitical positioning of places like Kanaky become more and more prevalent, and France is less and less willing to keep their word and to do what they know to be the right thing, right? They know this is the right thing. That's why they continue with the rhetoric that they're granting independence. This is actually their own crime that they have to stop doing. They're granting independence. So they know that that's the right thing to do, but in every other way, they don't do it. Yeah, so they're stated clear, long-standing ambitions to remain in the region, to retain the economic stranglehold, and to increase their military presence.
Yeah, that the last part of what you were just saying leads into this next question that I have, because I think there's the intent of colonization often gets mired in all these sort of enunciations of freedom, democracy, etc. I mean, you can look at how Israel portrays itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, or the United States as some sort of benevolent actor, an integrator or assimilator or a guarantor of freedom, even for the people that it is genocided or enslaved. And we see that in a similar kind of fashion with France, especially in the Pacific, but also, you know, something like Kanaky plays a strategic or geopolitical, kind of geostrategic like role in this sort of what we could call the new Cold War, what some people have called the new Cold War. But France, Macron himself has gone to the region, and with this Indo-Pacific Pact, he's also declared that China is the new imperialism of the Pacific, and I find that really fascinating because it's like, well, so then what's the old imperialism? So in some ways it's like it's this sort of a great powers game, but I think one of the differences though is that China doesn't have the kind of the outward forward facing like military bases the same way that the United States, France, and and also hasn't used these places as weapons testing, especially for like nuclear weapons and things like that. So I wanted to maybe ask you, what is, as part of this kind of broader independence movement, is there sort of rapprochement with China? What is the kind of a status of indigenous, Kanak people in this region, and like how do is it non-alignment, or is it more favorable to China or less favorable to China? So yeah, I was just kind of curious about that particular position.
Sure. So, in fact, Macron's moves to ditch the Nouméa Accord and unilaterally redefine the terms of the agreement for the process towards independence, and potentially also just ditch that idea altogether, coincided with expressions from Kanak leaders that they were interested in working with China, particularly economically, and continuing the economic relationship with China. I think they've been very clear that they will determine their own relationships in the region. France, the USA have absolutely no moral high ground to dictate to people around who they should be engaging with and what constitutes imperialism. As you quite rightfully pointed out, it's not China with military compounds on Kanaky soil. It's not China with military compounds right across Te Moananui-a-Kiwa, in fact, and it's not China, storing nuclear waste on Indigenous soil across the Pacific. And still undertaking weapons testing. So, this week coming, we have RIMPAC, the largest naval testing exercise in the world, happening in Hawaii at the same time as the Festival of Pacific Arts, I should add. And so, they carry out extensive weapons testing in our moana at that time as well. And France is one of the participating nations as well. And so these are, it's the weapons testing, it's the waste, it's the sexual assault rates that happen around these places as well. Of course, Okinawa is one of those places where wherever you have these military sites, you have increased sexual assault cases and human trafficking issues around these military bases as well. And so there are multiple issues around militarism in Te Moananui-a-Kiwa. And so, yeah, like I said, they have France and so-called USA in particular have absolutely no moral high ground to be talking to other people about imperialism in Te Moananui-a-Kiwa. They are the dominant imperial forces in our region. And they know it. And so a lot of this is just around them trying to secure, as colonizers do, right, Nick? They consistently erase their own criminality in order to point the finger over there. So they erase the background of, like you pointed out, well, who were the old imperialists if this is the new imperialism? So they don't want to say, of course, they were the old imperialists. They don't want to say that this is actually a project for retaining their own imperial privilege in the region. They just want to point the finger to other people. They do the same at the level of Kanaky as well, where they have erased every single thing that they've done to violate the Noumea Accord and every single thing they've done to violate human rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and everything that they've done to destabilize the process. And then they turn around, point the finger at Kanaky and say, well, they're violent thugs. And, we know through this long history of the doctrine of discovery, we know that when they start describing us as savages and thugs, that is the pretext for exercising domination over us. It's really bad saying, well, these people are not rational. They need military oversight to keep them in control. And Macron has done that. He's increased the military force exponentially since this has happened and has said that they will stay there. So this is classic colonial practice that we're seeing. And of course, it's an economic driver going all the way back to those papal bulls that said that you can do these things for your use and profit. The enslavement is a part of their story. The economic extraction is a part of their story, and their political dispossession is a part of the story. So it's all of the hallmarks of the colonial story are playing out in an increasingly extreme way in Kanaky.
Thanks for that sort of positioning, because I think sometimes even like Patrick Wolf and the elimination of the native, he talks about the settler always desires land, but doesn't. I think it's almost simplistic, because it's like, even in the context of Palestine, it's like, why would there be such an ideological political investment in a genocide, or even in Kanaky, it's like, why would there be such an investment in maintaining a military foothold? And for like the Americans, it's kind of funny, because it's like, well, just so that China can be the number one trading partner, like everyone else can trade with, no one else can trade with China except for the United States, which is kind of ironic, because like AUKUS, it's like, oh, you want to protect shipping lanes, but where are these shipping lanes going? It's like, and where are they coming from? It's like, so you want to protect shipping lanes from China that are going to and from China, but it becomes this sort of like circular logic. And I think oftentimes, even I would say in the Western sort of left, or the anti-imperialist left, it often gets ignored that there's actual people who live in these places, who are affected by these. Their labor is, subverted within this imperialist economy, this extractivist economy, which includes, as you pointed out, the sex trade and the devaluation specifically of indigenous women, or the use of racialized, women within this context. Like even the attempt to sort of close down the U.S. Marine base in Okinawa, their solution to that was like, oh well, we'll just move this to Guam, and we'll bring the sex industry and the people who are part of that there to Guam as well. Like that was literally the plan that they had. They don't want to see an end to this, and I think, at the end of the day, though, it's like that profit motive and Marx's law of value kind of plays an important role. It's who's getting that raw material. In this case, one of the major ones is nickel, which is essential for this, so-called transition, green transition, because now it's a main component in batteries, and the United States has sort of declared a sort of informal war on Chinese goods, whether it's the electric vehicle, whether it's their their green technologies. And so for Kanaky people to exert sovereignty over that one resource it is sort of a linchpin, and it would be a linchpin in the region. So I'm sure that even the United States has a vested interest in keeping this under the boot of French colonial rule. And so with that said, yeah, and so I think with that said, I want to maybe take look more at Kanaky itself, because what are like who are the sort of the array of forces who are advocating for independence, and what are their sort of political programs?
Sure. So I just, before we do that, I just wanted to point out, though, also that the Indo-Pacific strategy is an extension beyond China right across to India. And it's become, the focus used to be the Asia Pacific, right? And it's been extended over recent years to the Indo-Pacific, particularly in response to these rising tensions with China, because, the world still operates on the same economy of enslavement and indigenous dispossession now, right? That still needs these stolen indigenous territories and regions in order to be able to facilitate its economy, and it still needs access to slave labor. Now, if it's not able to get incredibly cheap labor and products from China, then the next spaces for that are generally in what they call the Indo-Pacific region, which is like more towards India and Southern Asia. So the India and Southeast Asia region also becomes the fallback for the slave labor component of the global economy. So it's not just the trade routes to China, it's the trade routes through that channel through to Southeast Asia as well. And remembering that Kanaky has a significant EEZ marine area, so there are obviously there's still naval testing and military exercises that happens in that area. There's also seabed mining that happens in that area, and then there's also obviously the marine traffic, the shipping lanes that go through that area as well. So all of those things have incredible economic and military relevance for that. The independence movements. So the independence movement, there've been multiple independence movements, and I should point out, obviously, I'm not Kanak. I'm in solidarity, and I'm a Moana sister of the Kanak, and in solidarity with them. So I'm loath to speak for them, but there have been multiple independence movements over the years who have collaborated in, to different degrees, and many of them now with the FLNKS movement have, that's a coalition of different independent movements, and a lot of what we're hearing now is reflections from them that the right to their independence is inherent and inalienable. And France has behaved so poorly. They did enter into this very generous agreement in good faith. And as it has always done, as it's happened here in Aotearoa with our government as well, and I know over on Great Turtle Island, many of the treaties there also, the bad actor, the poorly behaved bad actor is the colonial state in those agreements. And it's the same thing in Kanaky. And so for Kanaky, for that nation, the leaders there are now in serious consideration around what that discussion should look like, and they've also made it very clear that they require independent oversight of the discussions from this point forward, because they have been so severely undermined, because they've said one thing and then done the other. There is no basis for trust anymore. The French government have completely corroded that. So they have called upon the Pacific Islands Forum to support an independent delegation to oversee the discussions, which they've said need to be political, not military. And so that they're willing to still engage in those political discussions around what that looks like. But I think, it's France that threw the Noumea Accord out the window. It's France that broke it. And so understandably, many Kanak leaders now are saying, well, you broke it. We need to talk about what it looks like. It's not necessarily going to look the same. But you understand your responsibilities under the Declaration for the Granting of Independence. You understand there are responsibilities under the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and human rights responsibilities. And so it's upon those grounds and, the inherent Indigenous rights of Kanak peoples that these discussions must be centered. Mm.
And you mentioned real briefly um, I'm trying to figure out the acronym. It's the FLNKS. Is that correct? Was that
It's
the
in it's an for it's a French acronym as
Yeah,
well.
so the
So yeah,
Front de
that's the
Libération
coalition.
Nationale Kanak et Socialiste. So Kanak and Socialist National Liberation Front, which has two words that we're interested in: socialist and National Liberation Front. Because I think actually saw this article that came out in the Guardian a couple days ago. I think it was by let me see. Jimmy Noona, who's a member of the Kanaky New Caledonia's pro-independence FLNKS political bureau. And I started doing a little bit of research on that because I was like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that they were at the forefront of this particular movement. But one thing that they sort of have in their political program is this idea of like Melanesian socialism, which I thought was sort of fascinating. And I don't know if you knew anything about this particular group, their history, and sort of their influences and where they derived this kind of this idea of like socialism and national liberation in the context of Kanaky.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I know, I like again, it's not my people, not my whenua, so not my story to tell in its entirety. But socialist and communist movements also have found ground in places. We see this in many places around the world as well for Indigenous nations, particularly where colonization has taken a significant it's been capitalist, and it's also been characterized with religious domination as well. And so sometimes some of those religious groups have organized themselves to oppose Indigenous liberation as amongst their missionary groups, and that's happened in Kanaky as well. And so when they have been looking at obviously the shape and nature and characterization of the colonial process, you naturally look to the antithesis of that. And I think within socialist movements, and even within some communist movements as well, the well-being of the collective, the dismantling of capitalist structures and hierarchies, those things are features of socialist and communist arrangements that actually resonate with us, because even for if it's not going to be framed in that way, those are some of the characteristics of our natural way of being as well, is to look after the collective, and to have a non-hierarchical system of care for people in place. And so there have been numerous kind of communist and socialist leaders who have also been operated between Europe and France and the Kanak peoples, and they've worked with the Kanak peoples in the growth of their independence movement as well. And so, yeah, the growth of socialist theory in that space, in direct relation to Kanak independence, is a really interesting discussion. And one of the leaders for the Kanak independence movement here in Aotearoa, Susanna Une, has provided a number of really fascinating articles and pieces of writing around the usefulness of socialism within Indigenous liberation spaces. So yeah, a lot of it, there's been some incredible leadership that has come out of that space that has been overlooked. And some of the reasons behind it being overlooked is because of racism and colorism, and the fact that Melanesian liberation movements have not been upheld as well as other in other spaces, because they are darker skinned, because they're in a smaller place, and also because they're extremely suppressed by their colonial occupiers as well. So even for us in Aotearoa, one of our great resistance anthems is actually, it comes from a Kanak resistance anthem as well. And the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior here in Aotearoa that happened in the 1980s was the French government planting explosives on a boat that had just come back from a journey across to Kanaky, over to their waters, to protest French militarism and to protest weapons testing in the Pacific. And they got back here, and the boat was bombed and people were killed. And so these are well-known parts of our political history in our region, but the crucial component of that speaks to this long-standing struggle has often been, overlooked. Mm.
Yeah, and just this is my lack of knowledge, and I was mostly introduced specifically to like Maori sort of interpretations, or I guess taking up Marx and Marxism through Emily Rakete's work, and like specifically this piece called Maori Marx by I can't remember who wrote it, but I can't remember the name, but I thought it was really fascinating because we don't. There's, I guess, the United States is the number one settler colony, but it's also the number one anti-communist settler colony. So oftentimes we're not allowed to even engage in discussions about political and economic alternatives. And it's fascinating in the sense because Kanaky, like just reading, listening, but also reading, and coming from this completely from a like 100% novice outsider view, it's fascinating to me, like some of the particular programs and positions that they've taken, like even with the 1998 allowing French settlers um, suffrage in a sense for this vote, because I think a lot of times when people talk about decolonization, right, there's this sort of the settler kind of fear of like, they're going to do to us what we did to them, right? That's their sort of reversion. It's going to be like reverse racism or something like that. But in this sense, it was like it's almost like sort of an olive branch, and to say, well, we're going to create a new nation and we're going to become independent, and you're welcome to participate. Either you're welcome to vote. We're going to give you the right to vote in this particular project, but whether or not you can accept equality, which to many settlers seems like oppression, I'm assuming, and that's why they resist it. That's why they resist it in Palestine. That's why they resist it in the United States. That it's like there's like I wonder always, and I know you're not like in the movement, but I always wonder what that negotiation looks like and what that conversation looks like, because it seems to me there's much more of an extension of the benefit of the doubt to the colonizer than there ever is to the colonized, and when it comes to building a political and social alternative.
Yeah, and I perhaps I don't think we've probably made it really clear about the issue with the referendum. So thank you for bringing that up, because I'll just take a moment to clarify that. Within the Noumea agreement, they agreed to 3 referendums. So as I said, that was an incredibly generous, um, allowance by the Kanak peoples, and being mindful also that much of this is happening within the context of coercion. So these agreements happened at the end of a civil war, uh, and people were being brutalized. France was utilizing significant military and economic privilege, and weaponizing that against Kanak peoples. And so you, as a leader, you're consistently thinking about the very real material situation surrounding your people right now, the loss of life. People are crying. They, can often want the brutality at the end. It's difficult because others feel that you're making concessions. And in fact, their leader, Jabal, was assassinated because his assassin believed that he had made too many concessions and had sold the people out. And so, there's a significant amount of coercion, and some of it is good faith and some of it is benefit of the doubt. But I think we shouldn't also overlook the role of coercion, colonial coercion, in those in the reaching of those agreements. Now, to get back to those referendums, because France had been, explicitly and extensively importing people to further marginalize the Kanak population on their own lands, it was a deal breaker. It was a core part of that agreement, that the voting rights be frozen to French settlers and Kanak peoples present at the signing, the population that was present at the time of the signing of the Noumea Agreement in 1998, and their children, not new people who were being imported in. That was one of the key aspects of the agreement that Macron unilaterally decided, the French government, unilaterally decided was undemocratic and that they would throw out in their revision of the agreement. And they declared that last year. That would have allowed for another 25,000 French migrants to suddenly get voting rights on the independence of Kanak peoples in that land. So it was a significant undermining, as well as their ongoing discussions that and statements that they were going to review the whole agreement. That in itself was incredibly disruptive and corrosive of their good graces and generosity in that agreement. But to get back to the point of these alternative systems, I think looking at it, for as Indigenous peoples, we see the economic drivers behind colonialism. We understand that even with a political reformation and, the guise of democracy, Western democracy, which is anything but democratic, really, the guise of democracy has been used to exact extreme violence around, against Indigenous peoples, not just in Kanaky, but everywhere around the world, in South America, and Central America, and Mexico, in the so-called United States. Extreme violence has happened under so-called democratic processes. And so, that's a colonial fiction, that democracy is necessarily benevolent and kind and just. And similarly with capitalism as well, we've seen that capitalism is waging a war against Papatuanuku, our Earth Mother. We've seen that, that is a linear model that depends upon dispossession and slavery. And it's incredibly hierarchical, and it results in huge wealth poverty gaps, and it's incredibly racialized. And only one people, a small percentage of one type of people, come out on top of that, and it pits people against each other. So, even here in Aotearoa, in our own sovereignty movement, say we do get, political authority over our own worlds, you're still operating within a global project of a shared language of economic oppression, a shared language of economic priorities and capitalist priorities. So, I think the willingness to explore alternative models, alternative economic models, comes out of our deep understanding that colonialism is a global project that's facilitated, that one of the core aspects and scaffolding of the global colonial project is capitalism and its economic oppression of our peoples. And that's behind our openness to look at these models that often have features that resonate more with our Indigenous ways of looking after each other, including looking after our Earth Mother and maintaining us long term. Because heaven knows democracy and capitalism isn't getting us there. It's taking us in the other direction.
Yeah, and I also think it proves that neither liberal democracy or just liberalism and capitalism are naturally occurring phenomenon. They've kind of become naturalized through this really violent process, but we're proof that this is not a natural process. And in fact, it's very artificial and very alien to I would say, not to get essentialist, but but it's very alien to how human beings actually operate, and it exploits our connectivity as human beings in a way that, as you just pointed out, creates this sort of hierarchical system, whether it's through racialized logics, through a class-based system, to exploit not only ourselves but the earth itself too. And I think that's what's at stake here. Is it's really thinking about, people want to sort of minimize indigenous movements, minimize indigenous people, minimize indigenous knowledges, or paint them as sort of romantic, or paint them as something that's cast in a bygone era that never really existed, right? But in reality, if that was just the case, then why do you have to so often violently crush every single indigenous movement that offers an alternative, even if it doesn't pose a significant military or even political threat to these settler and capitalist states. It always, it always fascinates me the way that people, it's like, if we're such a non-threat, if this is nothing to be afraid of, and our knowledges are just belong in the history books, then why do you constantly need to assert this authority over our lands, our bodies, and our lifeways? And it's always ironic to me that that's even a question, because it's like, especially in this region, it's like, do you know how many times they had to drop a bomb in this area? It's like, it's one of the most nuked places in the world, next to the Four Corners area in the United States, which is actually the most nuked place in the world. And that itself is like an assertion of annihilatory power, to say there can be no alternative, right? We will literally destroy worlds to ensure that, and destroy any kind of imagination that exists. I don't want to get on a soapbox here, but you're just like really evoke.
Consistent, Nick. It's consistent across time. Like James Cook, the night before, James Cook was, and I always say thank you to our Kanaka Maoli whānau in our ohana in Hawaii, before they did the service, the great service that they did by taking him out. The night before, he wrote in his journal how important it is to regularly demonstrate your military superiority to the natives, so that they don't get ideas beyond their station. You must always remind them at regular intervals, which has nothing to do with responding to what we're actually doing. So Cook, as a colonizer, all the way back in 1779, was saying, and throughout his journals, he made repeated references to it, and he killed and shot at Indigenous peoples across our Moana region on a weekly basis, killed us on a weekly for no particular reason. So I spent a lot of time analyzing his journals and looking at the time frames, and realized he barely went a week without killing or torturing somebody, someone native in our region. And then the night before he was taken out, he said it explicitly, that these regular displays of military superiority and force is necessary to remind them of your supremacy, and to keep them, have them, second guess themselves before they act out. So, there's the demonstrations of military supremacy is inherent right throughout. And yeah, what you were saying just really made me think also about the fact that, the United Nations Permanent Forum have called upon all member states to repudiate the doctrine of discovery, and not one of them has. Since 2012, I think that recommendation came out. Not one of them have, and in discussions with them, they all say, just like the churches, also, oh, that's something historical. Great. So if it doesn't mean anything to you, if it's historical, doesn't mean anything to you, but we're telling you it means something to us, it's a simple exercise then. Repudiate it. Doesn't mean anything, repudiate it. They won't. So that says it does mean something. They say, oh, we're here for good. Okay, so then if you're here for good, then get rid of the soldiers. They won't. So, we know now how to read their actions. We know what these things mean. And so, their actions and their rhetoric, that it really exposes them. And it's the most poorly cloaked exercise as well. They're not exactly shy about it when they declare an Indo-Pacific strategy to retain their military presence and economic presence, at the same time as they're saying that they're going to get out.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate this conversation, Tina, and thank you for taking the time. And I just as some final closing thoughts, where's this heading in this moment? I know things are kind of unfolding fast, but also, what's the best way for listeners to follow along and to support what's happening in Kanaky?
Sure, particularly for English-speaking listeners who want to follow along with things. We have our own page, so there is the Kanak Aotearoa Solidarity page that we are consistently putting updates through as well. Absolutely, just like all other times of extreme colonial brutality, it's really important to uplift and center the Kanak voices, the Kanak reports that are happening from the ground. And so we're consistently trying to platform those through our Instagram and Facebook pages. So you can follow those. There is a global call, a global day of solidarity coming up on July 26th as well. So, look at how you may stand in solidarity with those peoples, and be mindful that, this is a part of the global colonial project. Those shipping routes and the strategic military positioning of Kanaky, and this is exactly why these large superpowers are trying to retain control. It's not for nothing, right? There's military importance to these things that are a part of a global military strategy. So this is connected to Gaza. This is connected to Palestine. This is connected to, global geopolitics and global oppression and economic privilege as well. So all of those things have global ramifications. It's in all of our interests to stand in solidarity and support the Kanak people in Kanaky, not least because we all must make a stand for human rights when it matters, right? So those are some of the things that are coming up that are opportunities for everybody to stand in solidarity with them. We are all making calls upon, and people can make their calls upon their political leaders in their space as well, around the importance of regional economic and human rights stability in the Pacific region, and that this is really the hot point for that. So we're calling upon the French government to demilitarize their response, to listen to the concerns that are being expressed by Kanak leaders, and to also allow for this independent oversight as well, and to support Pacific Islands Forum. And I want to say the Pacific Council of Churches as well have been really vocal and helpful in their call for independent oversight of the negotiations as they need to happen. The response needs to be political, not military.